We walk over the earth every day without a second thought over limestone caverns, abandoned mine shafts, forgotten service tunnels, never considering that the ground beneath us might be hollow, waiting, aware. But the people in tonight's 3 stories thought the same thing until they descended into the deep places and discovered that the underground is anything but empty. Lorinda Faye, a cave conservationist, crawled into a Kentucky passage that breathed around her like a sleeping animal and spoke her name in her dead sister's voice. Eamon, a mine safety inspector, entered a Pennsylvania coal mine that had been sealed for 60 years and found it weeping fresh tears and humming a lullaby from his childhood. And Delaney Croft, an urban explorer, mapped the storm drains beneath Chicago until a tunnel led her to a chamber where her own footsteps were returned to her from the darkness, slightly delayed, slightly wrong. These are not stories of ghosts. They are accounts of something far older, something that dwells in the stone itself. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let the weight of the world above you settle in. My name is Lorinda Faye. I work for a nonprofit that maps and protects fragile cave ecosystems across central Kentucky. And in February of 2026, I was sent to assess a newly discovered entrance to the Great Bat Cave System, a massive limestone network that runs for over 30 miles beneath the Green River Valley. And I've crawled through more squeezed passages than I can count without ever feeling anything but scientific curiosity. But what I experienced in a chamber the locals call the womb has forced me to reconsider every hour I've ever spent beneath the earth. The entrance was a narrow fissure half hidden beneath a fallen sycamore. I went in solo because my usual partner was out with the flu, a decision that violated every safety protocol but felt routine at the time. And I spent the first hour inching through a wet, winding crawlway no taller than my rib cage, the walls slick with condensation and the air thick with the clean, ancient smell of calcium and bat guano. The crawlway opened into a dome room maybe 15 feet high, and I stood, stretching my cramped spine, and swept my headlamp across the walls, which were covered not in the usual flowstone but in a pattern of pale, translucent ridges that ran in parallel lines, curving and dipping like the ribs of a massive animal turned to stone. I touched one, and it was warm, almost feverish. And when I pressed my palm flat against it, the ridge gave slightly under my hand, flexible, not mineral, but something organic, and a deep, resonant thud echoed through the chamber. A single heartbeat that I felt in my own chest, and then another and another. A slow rhythm of perhaps 4 beats per minute that set the air shimmering. I told myself it was distant water hammer, a pocket of air compressing somewhere in the system. But then my headlamp flickered, and I heard, distinctly and clearly, my sister Marlene's voice speaking from behind the ribbed wall. "Lorinda, you finally came down to see me. I've been so cold in the dark. They said you'd come when the ground thawed. Marlene died in a car accident when I was 11, and I have never spoken of her on any caving trip. Never mentioned her name to anyone in the organization, but here she was, her voice exactly as I remember it. The little lisp on the sounds and the way she drew out the last word of every sentence, and it was coming from inside the stone. I backed away, and the wall I'd touched peeled open, the parallel ridges parting like a mouth. And from the gap oozed a thick, warm, pink ray fluid that pooled on the floor and began to take shape, forming the outline of a small hand. A child's hand reaching toward me, and the voice said, "Hold my hand, Lorinda. It's only dark for a little while, and then we'll be together in the quiet." I ran, forced myself back into the crawlway, screaming and scraping my hips and elbows raw. And behind me the heartbeats grew louder, and the ribbed walls began to contract. the passage narrowing in a peristaltic wave that tried to grip my ankles, and I wriggled and kicked and finally burst out of the entrance into the gray February daylight. Covered in that pink-gray fluid that steamed in the cold air and smelled of breath, of morning mouth, of someone else's sleeping exhalation, I collapsed in the mud and watched the fissure seal itself, the limestone grinding shut like a healed wound. And I drove home and showered 3 times and burned my coveralls. But the smell wouldn't leave my skin for weeks, and sometimes when I lie still at night, I can feel that slow quadruple beat in the mattress, and I know the womb is still breathing down there, waiting for me to come back and hold my sister's hand. Eamon Riggs. I'm a retired coal miner turned MSHA inspector out of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and in October of 2026, I was assigned to evaluate the structural integrity of the old Hazelbrook No. 9 deep mine, which had been sealed with a concrete plug since a methane explosion in 1963 killed 42 men and left the tunnels too unstable to recover the bodies. And I've walked through more dead mines than I've walked through grocery stores. But Hazelbrook No. 9 was different from the moment I pulled back the weather curtain over the ventilation shaft. The air that came out of the dark was cold and wet and carried a smell I recognized as the specific mixture of bituminous coal dust and old timber shoring. But beneath it was something else. A sweetness like vanilla and decay. And my gas monitor showed oxygen at a breathable 19% and no methane. So I descended the steel ladder into the main shaft, my cap lamp cutting a cone of white through the absolute black. The drift ran east for about 1,000 feet, the roof sagging in places, the rails rusted and the ties rotted to punk. And as I walked, I noticed that the walls were glistening with moisture, not the usual acidic mine drainage, but a clear, thick fluid that beaded and ran in slow rivulets. And when I touched it, it was warm, blood temperature. And it left my fingers sticky with a residue that dried to a faint, salty white film. I was kneeling to collect a sample when I heard the first sob, a wet human cry that echoed up from the deep crosscut where the 1963 explosion had occurred. And my gut told me it was a trapped animal, a raccoon or a coyote that had found its way in. But then a second sob joined the first. And a third, and within 30 seconds the mine was full of weeping. 42 distinct voices crying out in a chorus of grief that made my knees buckle, because I absolutely knew, that these were the voices of the men who had never come out. The weeping stopped as suddenly as it started, and then a single voice, a woman's voice, began to sing a lullaby from the darkness ahead, and it was my grandmother's lullaby. It's an old Welsh tune she'd hummed to me when I was a boy in her kitchen in Scranton. A song I haven't heard since she died in 1998, and the voice was perfect. Every note and trill exactly as I remembered, and it was coming from a wall of coal that had no business singing. I walked toward it, not because I wanted to, but because the song pulled me. My cap lamp illuminated a seam of coal that had been carved into the shape of a woman. A rough but unmistakable bas-relief of a seated figure holding a bundle in her arms, and the coal was weeping. The black liquid streaming from the figure's eyes and mouth. And the mouth was moving, the coal itself shifting and cracking as it shaped the words of my grandmother's lullaby. The figure turned its head toward me. I saw that the bundle it held was not a child but a lump of coal shaped into a miner's helmet. And the voice said, "Eamon, boy, you've been underground too long. The sun is a memory. The coal is your home now. We've been singing for you since the year you were born." I stumbled backward. and the 42 voices returned, not weeping, but whispering my name in a layered, hissing chorus, and the walls of the drift began to drip faster, the clear fluid pooling around my boots and rising, thick and warm, and I ran for the shaft, splashing through the growing flood. And I climbed the ladder and burst out of the ventilation shaft into the October sunlight and lay on the ground, gasping, my coverall soaked with the sticky fluid that was now drying into a crust of white salt. And when I looked at my hands, they were covered in coal dust, fresh black coal dust that I hadn't touched anywhere in the mine. The Hazelbrook? No. 9 was sealed with a second concrete plug the following week, but I still wake up at night with coal dust on my pillow, and I can smell vanilla and hear my grandmother singing from somewhere far below, and I know that the 42 are still down there, weeping and waiting, and that the coal remembers everyone who ever walked its seams. Delaney Croft. I'm a civil engineering student at Northwestern and an amateur urban explorer who documents the forgotten infrastructure beneath. Chicago for a small blog I keep private, and in November of 2026 I got a tip from a city worker about an old freight tunnel beneath the near South Side, a relic of the pre-1900 network that was supposedly bricked up after a cave-in swallowed a work crew in 1911. And I found the access point behind a maintenance shed near the old rail yards, a rusted grate that pried loose with a crowbar. The tunnel was 6 feet high, lined with crumbling brick, and dry as old bone for the first half-mile. My footsteps echoing ahead of me in a regular, reassuring rhythm that I'd come to trust during years of drain exploration. I was shooting video with a handheld camera, narrating the history of the tunnel system, when I noticed that the echo of my footsteps had shifted. It was coming back to me a fraction of a second later than it should, a delay so slight I almost didn't catch it, but when I stopped walking, the echo took one extra step, a soft scuff of a boot on brick that was not my own. I froze, my headlamp pointed down the long black barrel of the tunnel, and called out, "Anyone there?" And my voice echoed back, "Anyone there?" in a tone that was a half step lower than my own, a subtle detuning. And then the echo continued, "Delaney, you're a long way from home. The lake is above you and the trains are a dream. Come deeper. We've been walking these bricks since the year the city burned." I backed against the wall. My camera screen flickered and showed a figure standing about 40 feet down the tunnel. A shadow in the shape of a man, but its proportions were stretched, legs too long, arms too thin, and it was standing perfectly still, head tilted, and when I moved my headlamp, the figure didn't reflect the light, it absorbed it, a blacker shape against the black. It took a step toward me, and my own footstep echoed again, and I realized with a sick cold lurch that the figure was echoing me, mimicking my movements with a slight delay, and when I raised my hand, it raised a hand that had too many joints, the fingers unfolding like a spider's legs. And my camera's audio picked up a sound that was my own breathing played back at me, but wetter, with a gurgle behind it, as if something was breathing through water. The figure spoke again, in my voice. "Delaney, you've been down here since the cave-in. You don't remember because the dark is kind, but you're one of us now. You've been walking the tunnels with your face for over 100 years. I turned and ran. And behind me, the echo became a stampede of footsteps. 12, 24, 100 pairs of boots slapping the brick in perfect unison, and I could hear my own voice layered into the chorus, screaming my name in 100 different keys, and the tunnel walls began to sweat black fluid that dripped onto my head and ran down my neck. And I saw, in the beam of my headlamp, the brick ahead of me was covered in handprints, thousands of them. all the same size, all with the same extra long fingers. I hit the grate and shoved it open and hauled myself into the cold November air. And I sat on the pavement, shaking, until a security guard found me and asked if I'd been in the freight tunnel. "No one goes in there," he said. "Cabin of 1911. They never recovered the bodies. But sometimes at night, you can hear footsteps under the street. I haven't gone back underground. But last week I found a handprint on my apartment window, handprint with fingers too long, and I know that whatever walks those tunnels has learned my voice well enough to follow me home." If tonight's stories have left you feeling the weight of the earth pressing down, know that you're not alone. The underground is the last true wilderness on our planet, a place where light has never touched, where time moves differently, and where things may have been waiting since long before we learned to dig. Lorinda, Eamon, and Delaney each walked into the dark, expecting stone and silence. Each walked out knowing that something else was already there, aware of them, patient and ancient, and terribly interested. I'm your host from True Terror Files Official, and these stories exist because people like you shared their experiences. If you've ever heard something breathing from a hole in the ground or felt the ground pulse under your feet, please leave your account in the comments. Your story might save someone from taking one step too many into the dark. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss next Sunday's deep dive into the hidden corners of American fear. Until then, keep your feet on solid ground and never, ever crawl into a space you can't back out of.